Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So today we'll be reviewing A Plus Unit 3. So it's from 1754, the beginning of the French and Indian War, to the 1800s, the election of Thomas Jefferson. So, as mentioned in the previous video, British colonies on the coast were growing in population and overall just wanted more land, so they desired to move west into the Ohio River Valley, where the French were there, also allied with the French with the natives. So the French and natives weren't happy, like even native groups, led by the Shawnees and the Delawares, allied together in order to defend their rights to this territory. Anyways, so the French and Indian War erupted in 1754. Basically, low-key, George Washington kind of sparked the first attack. Also started in North America, but the war soon spread throughout Europe and also parts in India and Africa, because Britain and France were already rivals throughout the world. So this triggered fighting in other places, turning it into the 7 Years' War. So Great Britain, anyways, won the war. Some effects due to this war, though, are the Treaty of Paris in 1763. It changed the map of British in North America, as Spain gave up Florida to Great Britain, because Spain was allied with France during the war. Also, France gave up territory west of the Mississippi River. And of course, France gave up the Ohio River Valley territory to Great Britain, the main reason for the war. But Great Britain prevented the colonists from moving westward by drawing the Proclamation Line of 1763, which forbade British colonists from migrating west beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Great Britain mainly did this because winning the war was very costly, so they didn't even have enough money to resolve conflicts if there was native and colonist conflict. And yeah, the colonists were very angry because the whole point of this war, the whole reason they fought was to move westward, and now they're being told they can't. Furthermore, with Great Britain's war debt, the cost of running the colonies increased by 5 times due to the larger population as well. So Great Britain began implementing policies aimed for tighter control over the colonies so they could also earn tax monies that was also very much needed. So George Grenville, the British Prime Minister at this time, helped develop a plan which first off started by enforcing existing laws that colonists were ignoring on account of solitary neglect, such as the navigation laws, which restricted the colonies' trade to Great Britain only. Also, wartime policies remained after the war was already over, such as the Courting Act. Also, Parliament began to enact new taxes to raise funds to pay down war debts, such as the Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Act of 1767, and the Tea Act of 1773. The colonists resented that they were being taxed without any representation in Parliament. No taxation without representation. Colonists believed laws were being imposed on them without their consent. George Grenville believed, though, they were getting represented, as members in Parliament represented interests of all English subjects, no matter if they were home or in a colony. But colonists got used to the idea of independence and representation. So colonies low-key began to unite and protest, such as the Committees of Correspondence, organize and spread information about colonial grievances. Examples are merchants, traders, and artisans created groups to fight for the repeal of the Stamp Act. Examples are the Sons of Liberties and the Daughters of Liberty. Even developed was the Stamp Act of Congress in 1765, where delegates from 9 colonies petitioned Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. Said taxation without representation was tyranny. Tyranny basically means a government ruler uses power in an unfair, cruel, or oppressive way. Also, by the way, during this time, neither the delegates or the colonists were wanting independence from Britain. They still want to remain as Britain's subjects, just without experiencing this much control and wanted their own rights. So, as a result of Congress, work, and boycotts, it led to the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766. But then low-key right after, Great Britain passed the Declaratory Act, basically saying how Parliament's still in charge and they can pass any laws they wanted to. You know, trying to say like we only repealed the Stamp Act because we wanted to, not because you guys made us to. Also, by the way, you know, other taxes were still went on though, and even more taxes were enacted. Great Britain still had a debt to be repaid. Although tensions started to rise, such as the Boston Massacre in 1770, British soldiers opened fire on a group of protesters in Boston. Even though it's called Boston Massacre, only 5 people died. But still, the news got spread and many were very angry. And there was the Boston Tea Party in 1773, where colonists dumped 50 tons of British tea into the Boston Harbor as a way of protest, which then Britain responded to this with the Coercive Acts in 1774, which closed the Boston Harbor until all the tea was repaid, and even introduced a new Quartering Act mandating that even more soldiers must be accommodated into colonial homes. In the colony's eyes, these laws were called the Intolerable Acts. Still, they weren't thinking to leave and completely be independent, although some revolutionary ideas that did contribute to it was the Enlightenment ideas such as natural rights. Life, liberty, and property was given by God to every human being. Also, the social contract. Humans must construct governments of their own will, and the government's main purpose is to protect everyone's natural rights. Also, religious ideals, such as the Great Awakening, also recently happened, which emphasized government/church telling you what to do was not important that much. Individuals must decide for themselves what God has to say. But even after the colonists created the First Continental Congress to centralize resistance to British policy, they still wanted to remain British subjects. And even after the Second Continental Congress, in response to British actual aggression at Lexington and Concord in 1775. This was basically British heard colonists were stocking up weapons in Concord, so soldiers went to seize them and arrest colonial leaders. But they were ready to defend their supplies. At Lexington, a shot was fired and 8 colonists died. But colonists, still continued to fight back and pushed the British back towards Boston. Anyways, many still thought best was to negotiate with British. But then in 1776, that's when the American Revolution happened. So, what happened? One of the factors was Common Sense, created by Thomas Paine, which argued how British tyranny had reached its peak and the only way for colonists to preserve their liberty was to declare independence. It used Enlightenment ideas and religious ideas. So, this pamphlet spread like crazy. So yeah, in 1776, Thomas Jefferson then wrote the Declaration of Independence and made argument for separation using Enlightenment ideas. Although also in the colonies, 20% of them were loyalists, which means 20% of them want to stay loyal to Britain. Only 50% of them were patriots, which means they wanted independence. And the rest 30%, didn't really have a say. But the American advantage, though, was that even though British had a superior army, the leadership of George Washington was he was literally like the GOAT. Well, for the first 6 months, Continental Army never won a single war. But then George Washington and his tactics, such as a surprise attack done at Battle of Trenton in 1776 against the Hessian troops, proved that Americans could in fact win. Benjamin Franklin also went to French to align with them, but then they were like, And then the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, the Patriots won, which gained trust from France that Americans could potentially win. So thus, French joined the war against British, sending aid, ships, and supplies to the Americans. Also, American had such a much stronger ideological determination and motivation than British, as Americans just wanted to secure their liberty, while the British just cared about economic and political dominance. So yeah, the final war was at Yorktown in 1781, and the US won. Then in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. and it ended the war and doubled the landholding of the United States. So, moving on to society. As a revolution was much about Enlightenment ideas and rights, like even the Declaration of Independence saying all men. Blacks assumed, maybe about them too. So this also helped develop the abolition movements, mostly in the North. Like even places in Vermont abolished slavery, Pennsylvania made a provision for gradual abolition. But the South didn't believe blacks were included in all men, and they relied heavily on slavery. Also, ideas for greater political democracy, as only white property-owning men could vote. And they believed it should be expanded, like to non-owning land people. Also, women certainly believed that the equality for which the revolution was fought ought to include them as well. Like Abigail Adams wrote to John Adams, her husband, to, remember the ladies when constructing the principles of liberty. But these were all just ideas, and it actually took a long time for actual change. But Benjamin Franklin created the idea of women's role in a democratic society as the Republican motherhood, saying that their role is to just thoroughly educate their sons. But it did expand women to some education though. Also, this revolution led to other revolutions throughout the world, such as the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and other Latin American revolutions. Now, moving on to the new republic. So first off, each state's government. Each state crafted a constitution, and they all shared similarities of that most of the power was concentrated in the legislative body. Makes sense because legislative was representative body of the people, which people prioritized at this time, the whole idea of independence. But they still had, limited voting rights only to white property-owning men. Now, the federal government. So, the Continental Congress in 1777 created the Articles of Confederation, the first constitution of the United States. This article kept the federal government very weak. So, state government had more power than federal government right now, which makes sense because they didn't want to have a huge centralized power again. Although this did lead to issues though. The federal government was too weak to handle international trade, such as Great Britain cut off trade between the US and the British West Indies, and Spain prohibited American trade ships from accessing Mississippi River via the Louisiana. Even pirates at the Barbary coast of North Africa attacked U.S. merchant ships, as before Great Britain protected them, but now U.S. had no protection. So, due to the lack of central power, Americans had no solution. Also issues with financial problems, as there was no authority to collect taxes from states. The federal government was very broke. Also, there was an interstate commerce, as there was no authority to settle disputes between each state. Although, even though U.S. won, Britain still kept forces occupying places along the western frontier, and federal government had no way to stop Britain's violation of the terms of peace. They had no authority to raise an army. Also, showing the weakness of the federal government was Shays' Rebellion from 1786 to 1787. A group of farmers had high debt, and the courts were taking their land if they couldn't pay. So, lots of economic issues. Also, many of them were unpaid veterans. The government owed them money. So, led by Daniel Shays, the group of poor farmers fed up, they attacked courts and stormed the federal arsenal. Although then the Massachusetts militia did stop the rebellion eventually, but the event had much larger consequences than the proportion size of the battle. It showed how weak the Articles was because the poor farmers and unpaid veterans were everywhere, so it created fear throughout the states. Although one thing that did come out of the federal government was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which regulated the vast and unsettled Western territory gained during the Treaty of Paris. It also reserved lands for schools, banned slavery in this territory, and dictated how territories in this western region could become official states. This passage still remained after the Articles of Confederation was scratched, by the way. Now, moving on to 1787. 55 delegates met in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention. The goal was to revise the Articles of Confederation, but the meeting shifted to the creation of a new constitution. After months of debating how to create more power for the federal government without it becoming tyranny, they answered it by the new constitution, which had, first, separation of power. Before, it was only one branch, like the one main branch, legislative, but now it had 3 equal branches, each holding different aspects of governing. Also, each would have power to check and balance each other. So, the 3 branches were the legislative branch, which created laws, which was a duty of the Congress, the executive branch to execute the laws, to enforce the laws, which was the duty of the presidents, and the judicial branch was to interpret the laws, which was the duty of the Supreme Court. The Constitution also created the idea of federalism, basically a system of government, so powers are shared between federal and state governments. Some powers were assigned to federal government only, like declaring war, while state government had powers such as running their elections. Some powers, like taxes, are shared by both the federal and state. Although there was some debates such as about representation, like the Virginia plan believed representation should be based on population, which followed the interest of large states such as theirs. Although the New Jersey plan believed that there should be equal representation, 1 representative per state, which favored the interests of small states like theirs. Thus was created the Great Compromise, which established a bicameral legislative, basically a House of Representatives, so a representation population-based, and the Senate representation would be equal. Also debated was slavery. It's how enslaved people should be represented. North delegates believe they shouldn't count as all. They don't treat them like people anyways, while the Southern delegates believe they should count as full members to the population. Thus created was a 3/5 compromise, which enslaved people counted as 3/5 a person for representation. Also debated was the importation of enslaved people. So basically the Constitution said Congress couldn't touch slave trade for 20 years after the ratification. But then in 1808, after the 20 years, international slave trade would be abolished. So, the Constitution still had to be ratified by 9 out of the 13 states. So, there were the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, who argued for the ratification of the Constitution, as articulated and argued in the Federalist Papers. Basically explained how federal government needed to be strengthened. Although there were the anti-federalists, whom argued against the ratification, like powerful states and a weak central government, believing strengthening the federal government would lead back to problems like they had with Britain. Also believed since the US was so large and diverse, the central government couldn't possibly represent all interests equally. Also, the Constitution had no Bill of Rights at this time, as many state constitutions did. So the Constitution promised to add a Bill of Rights right after the ratification, which they did. Anyways, the Federalists won in 1788 and the Constitution became ratified. Now, let's look into the new Constitution outplay and precedents and institutions developed. So first off, in the executive branch, George Washington was the first president, and the formation of the Cabinet of Advisors created, which grouped executive departments into 4 groups. Created was the Department of State, led by Thomas Jefferson, Department of War, led by Henry Knox, Department of Treasury, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Department of Justice, led by Edmund Ranford. This was never in the Constitution, but never prohibited in the Constitution either, so it's a precedent, and it still continues today. Also, precedent established was only max 2 4-year term for president, which was later established in the 22nd Amendment. Also, Washington's farewell address, which warned about traps of diverse effects of creation of political parties and about foreign alliances that would drag the U.S. into foreign wars. Now, looking at the legislation and judicial branches. So, passed was the Judiciary Act of 1789, which created a multi-level federal court system of 13 distinct courts and 3 Court of Appeals, and the Supreme Court with 6 justices. So, Now moving on to the formation of political powers. So, there was a Federalist Party led by Alexander Hamilton. Basically, this group descended from the Federalists. And then the Democratic Republic Party led by Thomas Jefferson. Basically, this group descended from the Anti-Federalists. So, how did these parties form? One reason was economic policy, like Hamilton proposed the creation of a national bank to establish U.S. credit and to create conditions for national economic flourishing. But the Democratic Republic said how the Constitution had no provision for the federal government to be able to create a national bank. But eventually, in 1791, the National Bank was established. Also, federal response to whiskey's rebellion in 1791. Basically, due to tax on whiskey, many Western farmers were enraged and rebelled. The federal response demonstrated that the new federal government was far more capable in keeping order, especially compared to Shays' rebellion. But it low-key made Democratic Republicans mad because they believed it showed force against legitimate rebellion, which is like tyranny. Also, foreign policy like the French Revolution in 1789, Democratic Republicans wanted to return the favor and aid French revolutionaries, but the Federalists believed it was best to stay out of it and, protect themselves from conflict and protect trade. So, even then, Washington issued the Neutrality Proclamation, which protected American trade and kept the U.S. from getting involved. Democratic Republicans got very angry, and even Thomas Jefferson resigned from Washington cabinets. He was very upset. Also passed in 1798 by John Adams, the second president, was the Alien and Sedition Acts. Basically, the Alien Acts, which allowed the president to kick out any non-citizens that deemed to be dangerous and deport them. Also, the Seditions Act, to limit political opposition, like criticizing the government or something, which basically made it possible for the federal power to low-key limit political opposition. And the Democratic Republicans hated this. So created was the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, basically stating that the Alien and Seditions Acts were unconstitutional and unenforceable. So now moving on about American identity. So basically it was about liberty, and the idea was about American to be free. We see evidence of this in the abolishment of aristocracy. Basically, the idea of a small group to have the highest and most power, like kings and stuff. And we also see this in religious tolerance. And we see these in ideas in art, literature, and architecture. Now, moving on to ideas of wanting to move westward. Like Britain and even Spain powers would help supply natives to fight against the Americans. So in 1794, George Washington dispatched about 2,000 American soldiers into the Ohio County and fought an alliance of American Indies at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which the U.S. won, and which led to the signing of the Treaty of Greenville, which opened the Ohio Territory to U.S. settlement without resistance. Also the same year, Jay's Treaty was signed, which basically Great Britain agreed to withdraw its forces from the western borders in the U.S. Then, 2 years later in 1795, the Pinckney Treaty was ratified, which formally recognized the borders between U.S. and Spanish territory, while also opening ports of New Orleans and the Mississippi rivers to U.S. merchants, which ended the opposition of U.S. westward expansion in the South and reduced conflict between the two states. Also debates on the spread of slavery westward, because the South wanted to go westward for land and to plant using slaves, but North opposed the expansion of slavery. At first, moral grounds. Also, religious people were up there like the Quaker. Also, free labor was a threat to paid labor in the North. Okay, so that's it for Unit 3. I hope you guys enjoyed. Bye!
Like and subscribe and comment.